Good afternoon or good evening, and welcome to this live stream from Boerma Instituut here in Aalsmeer. I've been here for about 4 days now, enjoying sharing floral design with a great group of students and the team here at Boerma. But I'm actually from Australia, so from the other side of the world, in a small town called Alstonville. And I don't expect that many of you will know where that is, but it's about 2 hours south of Brisbane, so it's on the middle of the east coast of Australia. And I've been travelling around for a little while, but this week I had the great fortune to work with some very enthusiastic and passionate students who wanted to learn a lot more about floral design. I'm making some handmade chicken wire here, so indulging in one of my favourite floral design techniques. But the class that we gave here this week was more about the actual design theory behind creating compositions, something I also love to do. But we're not going to do that this afternoon or during this live stream. I'm going to focus more on just explaining some designs that I've made for you, perhaps the techniques behind them, and a little bit about my inspiration and how they came to be. This format is fantastic because you get to ask questions. So if you would like, go over to the chat section of YouTube and type your question in, and then the team here will give me those questions and I will find an answer for you. If I don't have an answer, I'll make one up, but hopefully we should be okay. I'll put this chicken wire down for now, and the stub wire that goes with it, and we'll move on to the first of a few designs that I'm going to make for you. So the first one is a construction that starts with a form that is made out of hay, and in the centre of the hay there is a long piece of wire. You can see in this case it's like a kind of crescent moon that's a bit stretched and distorted, but you can make any shape that you like, a star shape, a heart shape, simply a circle or a disc. But here I decided to really stretch the proportions a little and to work horizontally. I have this bad habit, maybe it's not a bad habit, but a habit of working vertically and making things very tall, so it's nice to kind of move away from that every now and again and to work in a different way. And the team here at Boerma told me that the live stream is kind of a relaxed way of working. So I'm just going to imagine that I'm in my studio at home for the afternoon, making a few things and talking about how I'm making them, which is what I would do if I was in my studio, except I'd be talking to myself and not to you. So I started with this hay structure, which was actually made by one of the students during the masterclass this week here at Boerma. And so it's repurposed, so I'm upcycling. It's all about recycling these days. So we reshaped it into a slightly new form, bound it a little tighter so that it changed its thickness along the way, and then stretched it in this new direction. And then I have slowly added some feet to give it a fairly small footprint. You can see it rests on about 5 feet, 5 or 6 very small feet that are spread along a fairly narrow pathway if you look at it from the sides. I'll turn it front and back so that you can see. So you can see it's fairly shallow in depth overall. I also then have tied some cross pieces on and bound them to those legs, and that makes it stable. The beginning, this kind of structure is the hardest, and you often need the help of a friend to hold it in place while you bind it. But I have also simply used some paper covered wire or some bind wire to actually make single binds, so simple single binds to join all the materials together. We've used a combination of this very light but strong wood. I'm not sure what it is, maybe some type of willow. It's been, I think, had its bark stripped off and it's been bleached, and also these Mikado sticks, which I love to use because we don't get them in Australia. And I have already started adding on some test tubes and filled each one with a little bit of water ready for the flower placements. Often when I'm making this kind of design, I will add the test tubes as I go. But in this case, because we don't have until for another 5 or 6 hours, I thought I would start with some of them in place. I've only bound them in place in one spot. Usually if I'm starting, I would tie them in 2. But when you tie them in 2 places, it can make them quite rigid. So here, tying them in one spot allows me a little bit more flexibility as I add the flowers through. So I think that's all I can tell you about the construction at the moment. Oh, perhaps there's one more thing you might like to know, and that is that one of the secrets to making this structure quite stable is to make sure that as you tie some of the sticks together, you are tying in small triangles, or they can be large triangles as well. But the triangle is the strongest of all the geometric shapes, and if you can tie them subtly into the construction, you will make it sturdier right from the beginning. So it will be difficult for me to point them out to you now, but there are several key small triangles in this structure which really helps hold it together and make it very rigid. I'm going to work with mostly, I think, pinks and purples, using a combination of tropical flowers and other bulb flowers, but I'm going to start with some foliage. And in particular this alocasia leaf, this Alocasia amazonica leaf. We get them in Australia, they're quite seasonal, but the more I travel around Europe and Holland, the more I see them everywhere. I'm quite envious of their availability. So I'm just going to pop one of those through that sits from the front, because you're seeing the front side of it at the moment. I'm going to pop that into a tube so that it sits over towards the back, which you might say is a shame because we're not actually seeing the front of it. But the back of it also has this really lovely colour, this deep burgundy colour, and so I want to feature that in the design and not so much green. It rests in there quite neatly without needing to be tied in. So I'm just going to leave it there for the moment, and then I can start adding in some of the other materials. We might start with some of the largest and most difficult materials first, which is one of the ways I usually work, making sure that I've got room for those materials. And here we're going to use these lovely bromeliads. They're mostly pink with white tips in them, and I've taken them right down from the plant and stripped off the bottom leaves so that I'm exposing the white as well, because we want to minimize the green in this design. And what I've also done with this is to tie on the test tubes already. So I've tied a piece of paper covered wire around the test tube, I've bound it and so the bind extends out. I've bent the bind up and I'm tying it across the flower stem and binding it again so that it's actually attached to the bottom, and then I've popped them into a vase so that the test tube is already full of water ready to go. And then we can start binding them in. We're going to work asymmetrically, and so I'm mostly going to put the heavy weight on this side of the design and then bring a few materials over to this side, and mostly keeping the materials in an overlapping line system. One of the 5 ways that I think of organising materials. Once again, just using single binds to hold everything in place, and usually tying everything in 4 places. I also like to have a pair of small flat nose pliers on hand when I'm doing binding work, because you can very quickly give it just one more twist and it will hold it more securely and make sure it stays exactly where you want it to go. I'm going to group a second one in there, coming from a slightly different direction, being consistent with this overlapping system, but making sure that each of the flowers has their own space. so that they're not touching each other or touching the structure around the flower head. It just makes them a little bit more vital and allows you to appreciate each one more.
So, Mark?
Yes.
It's always before people ask questions, they also say hello.
Oh, hello.
We have Henny Dekker in the chat saying hello to you.
Hello.
We have Sally Hardy saying hello from Berkshire, UK.
Oh, from where I've just come from.
Nice.
It's nice to be part of the international flower community. I was lucky enough last week to go to the Interflora World Cup, which is kind of a bit like a family reunion because I have been very fortunate to go to, I think, the last 5 World Cups, and I keep running into people each time that are at each event, so they are a bit like a reunion. So I've tied 2 of those bromeliads close together so that they are a grouping at one end, and now I'm going to tie in one towards the opposite end. Excuse me. Facing it back into the design. You'll also notice that what I'm doing is keeping the flower heads towards the upper part of the design. I spent all the energy in the beginning making sure that the structure had a small footprint and lots of negative space towards the bottom. And so I don't want to spoil that by taking a lot of the material down low. So I'm keeping the majority of the visual weight high above the table. And I also want to work with the negative space that was already in the hay shape before we began. We don't want to fill it up necessarily. I often like to work with a few pieces of long bind wire so that I can work with one end and then slowly cut it off and use the remainder. It's less wasteful. So there we have the largest and heaviest materials in, so we can then move on to the next materials. And so I'm going to add some of the line materials, and in this case that is these lovely nerines and also these alliums. The nerines repeat the colour pattern of the bromeliads because they start with pink at the back and move towards white at the top. So we'll start by adding in one that moves from the main area over towards the opposite side. And since I have the tube already bound in one place, I can just find one more place to tie the head in. Again, making sure that it has nice space around it. Of course, I can always add a few more tubes if I need to as I make the design, but hopefully most of them will be already in place. My thinking about putting those tubes in was that I'm going to need most of the flower heads here, so I've placed a few of the test tubes over this side, but I've placed a lot towards the back, some facing upwards to hold the flowers in this area here, and then a couple over here that are going to be used on long stems like this nerine, so that we get to use the line of the stem as well as the flower head. But in the end, the greatest majority of materials will be in this side of the design.
So we have in the chat Jennifer Thompson saying hello from Wales.
Hello from Wales. Oh, I thought you were another Jennifer Thompson. I know another one from the other side of the planet, but hello to you.
And we have Anila Hindocha saying greetings from Kenya.
Kenya.
And Anila has a question for you.
Yes, what's the question?
What is the hay covered on?
The hay covered on? Well, it starts with a long piece of, let me see if I can find one. It starts with a couple of pieces of 18 or 15 gauge stub wire, which is 1.8 mil thick. And in this case, we simply joined a number of them together using floral tape. Or you can use bind wire to join them together. Or if you can find construction wire or fencing wire that is 1.8 or 2 mil thick, or as thick as you need the structure to be, then you can use one long piece of that and then bind the hay onto it. We started with a fairly even thickness of hay to begin with, and then slowly added more hand fills along the way to actually build up the size and the shape that we wanted. So I've got a few of the flower heads on the main side of the design now, and one on this opposite side. And I'm going to bring one or two more towards the back so that we have a greater sense of depth. Super important to try to draw the eye all the way through from the front to the back of the design. Again, just using single binds to hold everything in place. These narines are extraordinary. Most of the narines that I'm used to seeing are only about 30 to 40 centimetres long, but since I've been in Europe in the last week, I've seen them up to about a metre or 1.20 meters. Quite extraordinary, really. One thing I've done to them is to take off the little covering that comes over the flower as it's opening, and it folds down. Often it's green and then it turns brown. In this case, because I wanted to reduce the amount of green in the composition, I peeled them off. And I often peel them off if they are brown as well, because they may not fit in with the colour scheme, or from a commercial point of view, the consumer might think that they are dying or that there is something wrong with them. But it's just natural. So I'm adding a test tube for this one because I want it to stretch all the way over to the opposite side, and I don't have a tube in exactly that place that allows me to do that. And so I'm working my hands into the very center of the structure and binding it in place. It can be quite a challenge to get things in the position that you want them in the beginning, but the more stems you add, the easier it becomes, because the more places or the more opportunities you have to tie materials in. Then we can add some of these super long and lovely allium flowers. Again, making sure to take some across to the far side, which also helps really draw the eye along these horizontal proportions. And rather than have it sit down onto the structure here, I'm going to just tie it up a little bit so that the head is surrounded by space. We'll keep a couple of the alliums on this side, the long side, but I'm going to make one of them quite short and bring it in towards the back of the composition. Again, to create a greater sense of depth. I'm going to tuck it behind the bromeliad. It reduces the impact of the allium a little bit. I want the bromeliad to be more important than the allium, but it helps to draw the eye through and also to connect that purple colour into the design. Also, by bringing it from down here and up towards the bromeliad, it means that the lines of the alliums are overlapping, and so they're working in with the overlapping system of the rest of the materials. Similarly, I'm going to take I want the head of this allium over this side, but I want to use the line of the stem as well. So I'm going to thread it through the construction into a test tube that I've got in the back of the structure over here. So we'll thread it this way. Sometimes it'll sit straight in place for you, and other times you'll need to tie it in so that the head sits exactly where you want it to go. The stems are fairly flexible, so they will bend into nice shapes without breaking. We actually need to make him a little bit shorter, because we want to make this section of the design the densest overall. So just threading it through the network of the legs that sit above the hay form and threading it through into this test tube. And it's held quite nicely in place there. I don't need to tie it in another time, thanks to the structure. And just like I did on the opposite side, now I'm adding another one which is close to this one on the heavier side, but I'm bringing the stem from a completely different direction. And again, he sits where I want him to go because the structure is holding him in place. And I'm adding another one to the back, once again because we want to bring the eye all the way through this side of the design, from this very front all the way through to the back near the alocasia leaf. Okay, and then to build up the density a little bit, what I'm going to do is add in a couple of carnations and also a couple of Dianthus barbatus, the green trick. One of my favourite things to use. They go with every colour scheme. They're a great texture and I just think they're fascinating. And they last really well too. The structure is doing an excellent job of holding things in place. So it was worth taking the extra time to make sure that everything was firm before I began. And again, I'm bringing one stem back and now one stem forward, so that you've got this great sense of depth in the construction. So even though I'm really building up the density here, as I said right from the beginning, I'm trying to make sure that each of the flowers has its own space. It can be sometimes hard to know exactly how long to cut them, but it's worth practicing. And especially with a construction like this, it's fairly easy to put them in and pull them out if you've left them a bit too long. And if you cut them a little bit too short, you can either raise the flower up a bit and tie the flower head in where you want it, or you can just bring the tube up a little bit. Especially if you've only tied the tubes in one spot like I have, it's a fairly easy process. So I'm keeping those two heads fairly close together, but threading them one from the front and one from the back. And just to connect the burgundy colours, the darker burgundies and pink colours with the lighter shades, I'm going to add this grass flower, which is kind of halfway between the two. And also it repeats the colour combination of both the bromeliad flowers and the nerines, in that it starts out dark at the bottom, but it finishes with white tips. And I'm going to, again, extend one over to the long side and then bring most of the rest of them back into this dent side. In this case, I am also using the existing tubes if I can to hold them in place, even if that means sometimes putting two stems into one tube. But on most occasions when you're working in an overlapping design style, I would avoid putting two stems into one tube because you start to form these little radial points all throughout the design. If you aren't familiar working in an overlapping design system, then I thoroughly recommend that you start experimenting because it's a fantastic teacher. During the masterclass this week here at Boerma, which is one of the many classes that they run, one of the many opportunities you have to learn, then we focused on working in an overlapping system so that the students could really focus on the principles of design and how to apply them. And I think we can take just one more to the back. Bring him all the way through to the front so that he extends quite far, but he doesn't hide the other flowers behind him. If I turn this to the side, you'll be able to see, after I give the back one some water with the extra tube that I tied in, I'll turn it to the side so that you can see, even though it looks like a fairly shallow design, it has quite a bit of depth. So if I turn that this way, you can see that it extends all the way from here, all the way to the tips of this grass over here. So it has the illusion of being a fairly shallow design, but really it has quite a lot of depth. But that's compensated for by this exaggerated horizontal proportion, which I'm going to exaggerate a little bit further by adding in some extra line material.
We have a Sayat Safran in the chat saying hello from Malaysia.
Hello.
And Celika Cartes having a question for you. Can you tell me the name of the first flower you used?
The first flower, now that's a trick question because now I have to think all the way back to the beginning. I think it was the bromeliad. So it comes in many different forms, but we found a tray of this particular variety yesterday and I was attracted to the colour and also the colour combination because it worked in with many of the other materials that I had chosen to use. Bromeliads are something that I'm very familiar with working with because they grow in the very well in the area that I live, but they're mostly I think subtropical climate flower, but they do transport very well, so you do get to see them in many other parts of the world or in many other flower markets around the world. So I'm extending the line even further by tying in these bundles of steelgrass, and I have simply made them a stronger line by taking about 10 stems and wrapping them in paper covered wire. Fairly randomly, but it not only joins them together and makes a really thin line, but it also means you can bend them slightly to create very gentle curves if you need, which is what I've done in this case, to soften some of the lines. So that takes it out to a point at that end, and just for a little interest, I'm going to bring this one in the opposite direction and take it through to the other side. And I'm going to bend it quite a bit so that its thick end is somewhat concealed down towards the back. And then I'm going to tie it in at the top. And now that I'm nearly finished, you can see exactly what I was talking about before when I told you that my goal was to make sure that this negative space under here remained fairly open and that I kept most of the visual weight into the upper part of the composition. I'm just going to bind those two line materials together so they cross and stay in place exactly where I want them to go. And you can see it also adds a little bit of tension because you have the more visible one moving from this side to this side, and then you have the less visible or subordinate one flowing in the opposite direction. We might tie his end down a little bit so he feels even a little more passive. And I'm just checking the test tubes as I finish to make sure that they all have sufficient water in for now so that the stems reach down into water, and also checking that there are no unfilled tubes. There is one here, and I can either find something to go in it or to take it out. Often one of the hardest decisions in designing is knowing when to stop, knowing when enough is enough. But in this case, I think that there is enough to attract the eye into this part of the design, and then the eye flows relatively easily throughout. So I really don't need to add any more. So I'm just going to take it out rather than to fill it in unnecessarily.
We have a question from Anila Hindocha.
Sure.
Is there a wire inside the bear grass bundle?
No, there is not. When you bind it with the paper covered wire, particularly if you bind it using a traditional garlanding technique where you bind up a little bit and then you go back and then you go up and then you go back, and you do that all the way to one end and then you repeat it as you come down. If there's enough bind wire on there, then the strength of the wire itself will allow you to bend the grass a bit. If you really need it to bend in really firm lines and for those lines to stay in place, well then you could add a wire into the middle, and I'd recommend wrapping that in green floral tape or covering it before you begin, because the wire can be quite slippery and it's hard to get it to stay in the center of the bundle. Just weave those grass flowers through so they sit nicely, and there's the first design for you. So remember, if you have any questions, please send them along, put them into the chat. I'll be happy to answer them for you. It's one of the great things I find about traveling with flowers is that there's always something to learn, and questions from people often are things that a lot of people want to know, but other people are scared to ask. So don't be shy. Because your question is probably something that a lot of other people want to know. So when this live stream started, I was making a piece of chicken wire with my hands, and just this, I think this is 1 millimeter stub wire, and I was just forming a little piece of mesh just to entertain myself while I was waiting. Once I start, I usually can't stop. And I wanted to use the technique in this structure here, and you could say, why don't you use a piece of chicken wire from the hardware store, especially because this screen is flat. If I turn it to the side, you can see that it's extremely shallow. But when you look further into it, it looks more handcrafted, quite on purpose. So we made larger holes in the bottom, moving to smaller holes as you get towards the top, which you can't get in a piece of chicken wire that you buy from the hardware store. So I made an outline out of just stub wire and floral tape again, just like I joined the stub wires together in the long hay shape in the last design. And here I bent it a square at the top and then round at the bottom, so it repeated the shape of the container, and then filled it in with the chicken wire once it was made, and then we've covered it in raffia, just tying on individual pieces of raffia, covering the entire edge, and then also taking it through to cover most of the actual black wire. If you use it it's possible to use it and leave it black, But I find if you put something over the top of it, it gives you more control over the texture and the colour in the design. And here I wanted to add a more natural, softer feel rather than to leave the plain wire, and also to leave a lot of the space so that you could appreciate the transparency. We filled the container with floral foam so that it's just below the lip of the container, but it's also biofoam. And the happy coincidence here was that the biofoam and the colour of the container almost match, especially when the biofoam was dry. It was almost seamless. So when you wet it, it goes a different shade, but it still works in quite nicely. So it's almost like you don't need to cover it at all, like it's meant to be that way. Often if I need to cover foam, rather than to add moss, which sometimes takes up a lot of space, I will use things like lentils or rice or grains of some description, because they're still very organic, but they allow you a lot of control with just a thin layer. The other thing I did was to make sure that we had a little bit of negative space down here, so just like in the first long design where we worked on those little feet and allowed space at the bottom, I wanted to do the same here. So we've taken the shape and elevated it onto some stems of green cornice, and I made a very conscious decision to place that screen symmetrically over the top of the vase, so that we've started with a very symmetrical structure. But I'm going to work a little bit more unevenly or asymmetrically with the flowers. And you can see I've already started to do that with the cornice, because there's one piece of cornice over this side, and then there are 3 pieces of cornice here, and then there are a few crossing pieces of cornice at the top, and then one piece of cornice. It starts to extend the silhouette over to the opposite side and down past the vase. So now we're starting to bring a bit more of an asymmetrical feeling into the composition. And here we're going to work with some browns and some apricots and some greens. And once again, I will start with the hardest and most difficult materials. And in this case, it's going to be another alocasia leaf. You can tell I'm obsessed with them. And perhaps this piece of flax or phormium, native to New Zealand, I believe, where I will be in about 2 weeks. So I'm going to take it into the back of the design to be a contrast to the transparency of the mesh screen that I've made. What you can also see that I've done is to tie on the bottom of an orchid plant, the base of an orchid plant, onto the screen, which allows some of its roots to fall down. And I've placed the phormium leaf over to one side. So again, working a little bit more unevenly. And I'm going to cut the top fairly flat, like the top of the structure. When I first went to put in this Phalaenopsis plant, my initial impression was to place it down here onto the container. But then that really interrupts this negative space that I planned right from the beginning in the design, and it also covered over this line here, which repeats the bottom of the shape of the container. So I elevated a little bit, which kept the space. It also allowed me to capture a bit of space with the roots, and also to keep this bottom line of the structure exposed. And once again, even though this side of the alocasia leaf is spectacular, we're going to work with the back of it because the colour works very well. And in many cases, we're tempted to put it down towards the bottom, to insert it into the foam down here. But I think you get a more impact and a more contemporary result if you take that visual weight right to the top. So I have placed a test tube up into the top of the composition so far and tied it in place, and I should be able to thread this through, hopefully, so that the leaf sits and falls downwards in the same direction as the axis of the whole composition. So it falls down vertically. I'll turn it around so that you can see exactly what I'm talking about. And also you get to see the burgundy of the leaf rather than, if I turn it a bit more, you can see the variegation there, which has more impact. So we're reducing its impact a little bit, but making it fit more within the overall style of the composition. Then we're going to add in some Phalaenopsis orchids in a beautiful colour that I'm not sure that I've ever seen before. They're a fairly small orchid and they are multi-branching, so they've got clusters of flowers at the top and then some side branches, most of which I have tried to keep. But I've also had to edit some of them out to give me some stem to work with. And just like I did with the bromeliads in the first design, I have already added tubes onto the bottom, taking some wire around the tube and then up the side and over the stem to hold them in place, place them into the vase of water so that they're already full, and it means that I can fairly quickly tie them into the composition. In this case in 2 places. And I'm going to tie most of them onto the front of the design, but of course if we take some towards the back of the design, it also means we get to appreciate the depth in the composition. And I'll do that first of all so that you can see exactly what I'm talking about. I'll take another one. Because they're multi-branching, they're all clinging together in the pot. So it's a bit of a jigsaw puzzle to get them out. You can see the multi-branches there on it. Still quite a few to open. If only I could fit them in my suitcase. So even though you might not be able to see this one as I place it in immediately, if you are looking at it in real life, it would draw your eye all the way through to the back. So you're looking at the front of the design now, and I'll turn it to the side once I've secured this second tube in, and you'll see that it extends the depth because this flower is looking backwards. But I don't always think it's a bad thing to see the back of a flower. Often the back has a different texture or a different colour that can be just as interesting as the front. Just like the alocasia leaf that we've used up here has 2 different ways we can use it. I'm doing the same with the orchid there. So you see when you look at it from the side that those stems move up and outwards, so they really increase a sense of depth all the way from the front here all the way through to the very back to the tip of this orchid. So it feels very shallow, but it actually has quite a bit of depth. The good thing about these multicoloured orchids is that they give you lots of opportunity to work with the colours within them. So when you look into this flower here, you can see that not only does it have some gold and yellows, but it also has some white. There's a very tiny little bit of a kind of red violet colour, kind of from the burgundy part of the colour wheel. So lots of different opportunities to pick those colours out with the other materials that you're going to include in the design. So I'm going to cluster a few more around the alocasia leaf over to the opposite side to where the cornice is hanging down. I'll turn it in just a moment so that you can see it. Because we want a little bit more weight on the opposite side so that it balances up this long extending piece. And I'm going to I'm going to edit off one of those tiny little branches, sorry, just so that those orchids now fit in at the top and have their own room. Then we might need to add in a couple of test tubes in order to get in these anthuriums. So these, I think I'll use 2, but maybe even just 1 once we get it in. They will help to bridge the colour between the back of the alocasia and the throats of the phalaenopsis, and then the other brown colours in the design. So I've got to find a place for the stem first, or where I can tie the stem in, and then I will add a tube for it at the back. Using the natural paper covered wire, which blends in perfectly with the raffia. Dropped that piece. Sometimes you need 4 hands. It often helps if you curve the wire before you're placing it in, so that as you hold the flower in, you can stick that hook through and it will catch where you need it to, and then you can easily capture the stem and hold it in place. And remember to use your small pliers if you need to make sure that the bind is firm. So I've threaded that anthurium all the way through the structure so that it comes to the back, and I'm going to add the test tube into the rear of the structure. That will also make the anthurium sit forward just a little. And I'll use a longer piece so that I can make sure that it goes through the structure easily. Don't be shy if you have any questions. This design seems fairly simple, but there's a lot in it that I could talk about if you want. I guess one of the things that inspired this was that when I was at the World Cup in Manchester, the symbol of the city of Manchester is the worker bee. So there were not only lots of bee motifs around, but in the World Cup competition and elsewhere there was lots of honeycomb structure. So lots of this kind of multi-sided shapes being used in patterns and interior design and architecture, and also in some of the structures that were given to the competitors during the competition. And you can see when I turn that one around, how the colour of the anthurium connects right through to the colour of the alocasia leaf at the back and coordinates in with all of the other colours, particularly the colour of the buds of the phalaenopsis as well. I don't want to add in too much more material, and I think it might even be too much to add in this second anthurium. Oh no, it actually works quite well tucked in underneath the first one. So tucked in here as a little grouping, it adds some more visual weight to the opposite side of the long downward direction. So I'm going to tie him in, once again threading him through from the back and placing a tube at the back, which helps hold him out at the front because he's on a slight angle, and now they work together as a grouping. And while I remember, I'll fill all those tubes with water. Of course, the Phalaenopsis orchids already have water in from being in the vase. And to finish it off, what I'll do is to take a few pieces of material right down to the bottom. It's not absolutely necessary, but in this case I think it would make it a little bit easier for the eye to travel the entire length of the axis of the design. And I'll build up a little bit more density towards the top where I've got all the orchids, but without adding any more colour into there. So in this case I will do it by bringing in a few more green trick. So we can tuck them up in around these taller placements mostly at the front, but maybe also some at the back. And I've also removed most of the foliage as well, so that you have only the stem, the line of the stem. Actually, let's cut that down quite a bit, and I'll tuck one under the tallest anthurium there. And because we want him to stay exactly in that position, I'm going to bind his stem to the structure. And you can see that I'm binding quite a way down the stem. If you bind it up higher into the structure, then it almost looks like it can be a little bit strangled. So we want to have space around each of the flowers, even though they're quite close together. So by binding it down here, we give it a bit of freedom to be able to sit away from the structure and yet have the base of its stem go into the water source. And I'll take one more to the back. So even though I'm not adding a lot more colour, I'm just building up the density in that area, making more mass in that part of the design. And as I said, I'll finish it off simply here, but I want to keep that space as I highlighted in the beginning. So I'm going to work right down onto the foam and bring either some of the same elements at the top or some of the same colours right down to the bottom. So I'll use this remaining green trick, and then I also have another carnation and a couple of silver and red leucadendrons, so in the same burgundy colour, and then this kind of golden colour out of the throats of the orchid. And they also, when you get close to them, have a tiny little bit of burgundy in them, and to bring, even if it's only just one of those, right down into the bottom. And not in the very centre of the vase. So we don't, again, want to work completely symmetrically. We want to create a little asymmetrical grouping. So all of those bottom placements are going straight into the foam, and I'll rub my finger over the top of the foam to smooth out any marks that I've made with the stems that I've been placing them in. And then I really don't need to add anything over the top because it's quite neatly finished that way. So as I said in the beginning, I started out with a very symmetrical structure, and now I've started moving away from that even structure by bringing it out to one side at the top here with the heavy leaf and the Phalaenopsis plant, and then by bringing out some sticks on this side and capturing a little bit of negative space, which also helps to draw the eye all the way from the top of the design back down to the bottom, so helps to improve the rhythm. So that's that design for you. Thank you. We'll put that one to the side.
It's so beautiful.
Thank you. Maybe we'll put it to this side.
So, Mark,
yes.
How do you choose the color combinations of the flowers? What makes what makes the flowers combine so perfectly together?
Oh, well, for me, it's looking at the materials themselves and seeing what colours are in them. So usually deciding on using one or two materials. So in that last instance, or in this instance, if I look at this Phalaenopsis orchid, I look into the plant and I see all the colours that I can identify in it, not only in the front, but sometimes also in the back, and even sometimes in the foliage and the stem as well. And out of that, then I can choose other colours that might coordinate with that and will blend very well. So that's one way of looking at it. I can also use colour theory, like the colour wheel or the pigmentary theory of colour. I often do that if I get stuck with a corporate event where the client will bring the colour scheme of their corporation or their logo, and it's something that I don't particularly find appealing, but I need to find a way to work with. So I'll identify where the colour or colours fall on the colour wheel and what kind of harmony they make or don't make, and find a way to make it harmonious. The same with brides. If they are having attendants and they bring in a colour swatch of the material that the attendants are wearing, then I will look to the colour wheel, look usually towards the colours beside it, to the hues either side, so that I'm creating an analogous colour scheme, which is fairly pleasing and easy to look at. Or sometimes if I need a bit of contrast or to make it a bit more exciting, I'll look directly to the other side of the colour wheel, to the complementary colours, and use either a tint, tone or shade, even if it's only a small amount in the flowers, to make it a little bit more contrasting and a little bit more exciting. But there are all sorts of ways that you can use colour. I tend to buy fashion magazines and look at the way fashion designers apply different colour combinations to fabric and to garments. I find that can be quite inspiring. Not only the ones that you like immediately, but look to the ones that you find quite challenging and don't understand, and continue to examine them to look for ways that the designer might have considered when putting the garment together to make that particular combination work. In this structure here, I have used more of the Mikado reeds, again because I don't get to work with them very often, so I seize the opportunity when I do. And I have used the Tatami technique, so taking lines of the paper covered wire, tying it around bundles of the Mikado reed, and then tying, say, 5 lines, I think I tied in each of these cases, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines of wire onto the first bundle of Mikado reeds, and then twisting 4 times, and then adding another bundle and then twisting 4 times along each of those 5 wires, and then continuing to add bundles until I got to the width that I wanted. And I have used the reeds the way they grow, so that they're thicker at the bottom and thinner at the top, and I've bound them more tightly together at the bottom and left them a bit looser at the top. And I have also used layers of them. So I made one big sheet that was in the middle, which you can see if I turn it towards the side. And then I made some smaller panels that sit out from the main panel to create a little bit of depth. It creates different areas of density here and here. So there are 2 layers at those points. And in between those layers, I have sandwiched some test tubes. And then I added some feet. So after I made the actual sheets of tatami, then I needed to find a way to make it stand. And in this case, I used the stub wires, the 15 gauge stub wires, or the 1.8 mil stub wires, and I took a bundle of 6 or 9 of them. In this case, when I'm making a T shape, I used 6. And I joined them together and wrapped them using paper covered wire. When I got down to the end of the leg, I bent 3 wires out this way and 3 wires out that way, and then covered them as well to create this shape. In the bottom of this structure, instead of creating 2 feet, I've created 3 feet. So the initial bundle started with 9 wires, and then I was able to pull out 3 feet, which each had 3 wires in it. And it makes it quite strong. And there are 3 of those in the construction, and each of the feet are slightly different lengths, so that it's not completely even. If I turn it to the side again, you'll see that I have worked with them in uneven ways. So this foot is much longer and turns up at the end. These 2 are shorter and turn up at the end. The one on the opposite side is quite long. And again, they're varying all the way at the back. And so I simply tied the first screen, the widest screen, onto the legs towards the outer edges of the screen, tied them in 2 places. And even when those 2 legs were on, it was enough to make it stand. But then I added a 3rd one on, because as I showed you, when I turned it towards the side, I turned the ends of the feet up, and then that gives me somewhere to tie more bundles of sticks on, which helps to not only strengthen the entire form, but it also creates a greater sense of depth. And then as we add the flowers, we have more opportunities to tie the bases of the stems into. And so I've already started putting test tubes on. I've tied some of them on individually, but when I first started, to make it a little bit easier for myself, I started making little banks of test tubes. So using the same technique as for the screen here, what I call the Tatami technique, or is sometimes referred to as the twirling technique, I just bound groups of, I think, 4 and 5 or 6 tubes together so that it was easier to apply them or faster.
So I forgot to say one comment in the chat.
Yes.
Hannah Best says about the previous design,
Yes.
interesting design, such unusual colors, but very beautiful.
Thank you.
And we have Alison Bradley in the chat saying, hello, Mr. Pampling. Sorry I'm late. Different time zones.
Hello, Mrs. Bradley. Best wishes to you up there in Kippen. So, I got the test tubes in, I got the banks of test tubes in the center of the design. I added the second smaller panels on so that we create more depth. Then I added the outside bundles on and tied them not only to the feet at the bottom, but also into the top. And as I did that, I also added some of these cross pieces, because when you use the Tatami technique to join all the reeds together, you start with this very parallel system. Which is fine, but can look a little bit rigid or a little bit static. So I wanted to add a little bit more fluidity or a little bit more interest in it. So not only did I tie some of the bundles on in slight angles, but I also took some that were more contrasting, not quite horizontal, but on almost horizontal angles, a few in the top and also a few in the bottom. Those horizontal or near horizontal pieces also make it much stronger, because if you look at this one at the bottom here, you'll see that that bundle of sticks is tied onto each one of the legs that come up at the front, and so it connects them all together and makes it super strong. And then I have started working with a couple of pieces of celosia, and I have added them in first because they were quite tricky, particularly this one, as if I turn it from the side, because you can see that it is sandwiched in between the 2 sheets of tatami there. So you had to thread it through down, and I threaded it out towards the back, coming into a test tube here at the back, and then having to wriggle the tops of the reeds so that they fell back into place and weren't caught within the folds of the celosia. And then I've added another piece into the back to create a sense of depth. So once again, even though this composition is has very shallow depth, we're going to add things into the front and things into the back so that it gives the eye this greater feeling of depth in the finished composition. We're going to stick with autumnal tones since it's now autumn here in Holland and on this side of the world, and I'm going to use a combination of callas and Nephofia, and also a few of this Crocosmia and the Leucospernums. So just like I did in a couple of the other compositions, over the last few days, I will start with the most difficult material, which is usually the largest, but also it's sometimes branching material. If you put the branching materials in first, then you can thread the other materials through them. So here we'll start threading these thinner stems through, and because we have most of the tubes in place, it should be a fairly easy process. Should be a fairly easy process. And because the structure has lots of lines of wire and small holes in it, we can actually use it to hold the materials in place without having to bind them. So it's simply a case of threading them between the layers or threading them through from back to front. Just watching that they don't get caught on the reeds at the top, and ensuring that their stems go down into one of the tubes. And of course, if you find the perfect spot for a stem, but it's not going exactly where you want it, then you can always add another tube.
So we have Michaela Wilding in the chat. She's saying, "Hi there, everyone. I am so sorry I couldn't join your live stream earlier. Also, very sorry I couldn't join your wonderful masterclass at Boerma School. I hope there will be a next time soon."
I hope so too. It was a lot of fun. We had a great international collection of participants who I think not only learnt from me, but learnt from each other. It was a great sharing environment. So it would be great to come back and do the same again one day. So threading a few of them through the actual structure, and now I'm going to take a few towards the back because I've already tied some tubes into the very rear of the design. Bringing a couple just above the top of the reeds to extend the silhouette a little. And I'm also going to take a couple of them and invert them. Mostly we will keep all of the materials in this upper part of the design. There's already quite a lot of interest down here, and there's already a lot of depth when you look at it from the side. So rather than to drag the eye down here unnecessarily, I'm just going to add a few highlight materials, some of this same material that we've just been adding into the top, and maybe one or two others, but I'm going to invert it. And it should last relatively well out of water because it's still in bud form, and so it is not going to droop fairly quickly, but it will bring that same colour and feeling right down to the very base, but in a subtle way. I'll do some at the front, and I will do a couple at the back as well. I'll turn it around in just a moment so you can see exactly what I've been doing. Grouping it together. And these have slightly curvy stems, so they start to soften all of the rigid stems of the Mikado reed that were made even more rigid using the Tatami technique. I can usually get away with tying them in one spot because most of the weight is in the head, so it pulls it towards the bottom and keeps them straight. But if you need to, you can always tie it in a second place down towards the bottom. And you can also use those near horizontal placements at the bottom to thread them through and to help hold them in position as well. I have mostly used medium-sized test tubes, so about 16 mil in diameter, but the Celosia are really thirsty drinkers and they have fairly thick stems, so I have tied in a couple of extra large test tubes for them. Now that we have some of the difficult materials in, I'll add a few of the others. So the Leucospermums need quite a lot of space. Their stems aren't so thick, so I can usually thread them between the holes in the tatami, but that's something that you need to take into consideration as you're making the sheet of tatami, is how wide you want the holes, especially if you're going to be threading materials through. So I made sure that my the gaps between each bundle of Mikado reed was about 8 or 9 millimeters, so I could actually get these stems into the tubes through the screen.
So we have our friends from Taiwan giving you 3 thumbs up.
3 thumbs up, thank
Yes.
you. I haven't been to Taiwan for a long time, but I very much enjoyed my time there when I went a few years ago. So I'm using the natural curves of the stems and the way the heads face to create a bit of interest as well. I've got the heads mostly looking upwards. I'll show you in just a moment. But also tilting forward a bit so that they capture the eye a little bit more. So I've grouped 2 together on the one side, and I'm going to bring another one towards the opposite side. So working a little bit lower. I might need secateurs for that one, it's quite thick. And again, if their placement is super important, then don't hesitate to use a little more paper covered wire to hold them exactly where you want them. And this one faces forward a little bit more. And when you look at the placements, you can see that I have almost organized them in an asymmetrical triangle. So working 2 close together, this medium space and then a larger space between those 2, which is always a good way to help introduce impact and rhythm into the design. Now that we've got all those heaviest placements in, I can start threading through some of the line material, the Nephofia and the callas. Just taking a little bit of each of the callas first.
We have Pixie Petunia in the chat saying very late in Brisbane, but I was compelled to watch and say hello.
Hello Pixie Petunia, it's nice to have you on board with us. So threading these lovely callas again, taking a few of them, or the tops of a couple of them, just so that they sit a little bit higher above the reeds, but still feeling fairly connected to this band of material in the upper part of the design. Depending on the occasion, you can potentially even get away with turning a couple of those upside down and even sealing the ends and using them out of water. They will last for quite a while. So if you have an event, then you might be able to use that. Or if it needs to last for a day or 2 before you get to pull it apart, then you could potentially use that technique. Otherwise, I would try to find a way to give it a water source. And by using the natural curves in the stems, we can get their heads to sit with a little bit of space around them so that they don't look like they are completely flat against the screen. And so when you look at it from the side there, you can see that we're building up a lot of depth all the way through. And this is where the structure becomes super handy, because I can now use not only the tatami screen but all of the other stems that I've already put in and the side stems to help hold the callas in place without having to bind them in. So it can be a fairly fast process. And if I can even tuck some others in between the structure as well. I'll turn this around so you can see this last placement, which sits in between the leucospermum and the celosia. So it starts to form a greater sense of depth on this side of the design. What I'm trying to do as well is to stay relatively within most of the silhouette, maybe coming out a little bit at the top and just these small bits at the side, but I want to keep the feeling of mostly a rectangle overall, a fairly geometric silhouette. I'll add another calla and then a couple of Nephofia.
Alison Bradley says, "You are the king of tatami, Mark, and always will be. Perfection. Kisses."
Thank you, Alison. It's practice makes perfect, and I've had a lot of practice. But like the chicken wire technique that I was showing you when the live stream started, it's one of those things that once I start, I often can't stop. And I have a lot of tatami materials in my house. I used to have a dining room lampshade made of tatami. I have several large objects in my shop that are made of tatami. I don't think I'll ever be able to stop. So adding the Nefophia, which have quite strong stems, but I can thread them through some of the structure work and holds them in place. Maybe trimming off a bit of the stem if I need. And they have nice little points which rise upwards just like the callas. Tucking some to the back. Keeping the stems fairly upright, but making the most of the natural curves in the stems as a feature when I can. Slightly softening the lines of tatami.
We have Christina from Hungary saying hello.
Hello.
And says, "I love all the ideas we are hearing here. So useful."
Good, great. Maybe if you put your Instagram account in the chat, and then you can show me some of your work, and then I can have a look. I can see you putting the ideas into practice. It's always good to see how other people take ideas and to make them their own. I think we can get one more of these pokers in, down towards the front, using its natural curves. It might need binding in place. No, it's going to sit there quite neatly. No. When in doubt, use a little piece. It's better to be safe than sorry. Also allows us to get it to sit out from the structure a little bit. When you're working in shallow depth, those small spaces become super, super, super important. So that the materials don't look like they are too squashed. But you can see I'm keeping these materials fairly close together, so I've got a large grouping here and then a secondary grouping over here, but making sure I'm paying attention to keep a section that is fairly open and transparent, which is also the area where you have a single layer of the tatami in the back. We might need one more colour in over this side to build the grouping up there. Which is held in place fairly easily with just the structure and the strength of the stem. And we can finish off with a few cruspedia, so bringing out the yellow that's in the very tips of the leucospermums, in the throats of the callas, and in the base of the Nefophia, and also in the tips of the crocosmia as well. And they can be fairly easily inserted into the test tube, sometimes sharing an existing test tube, or even being used out of water, because they will usually keep their colour and dry fairly well into the arrangement. And so taking some through to the back to build up depth from the beginning, and then we'll finish by taking a few through to the front. And see there's ones that I placed in the back here. And often cruspedia have a straight stem, but the stem starts to curve towards the head, so we can use that to our advantage as we pop them in.
So we have Jill Hoskin in the chat saying, amazing designs as always, Mark. So inspiring.
Thank you, Jill.
And we have Midori Kitahara saying hello from Tokyo.
Oh, hello Midori. Nice to see you online. Again, I've seen Midori online quite often over the last few years, but I was also lucky enough to meet with you again in Australia in person earlier in the year. So thank you for joining. So just dotting a few of these through. I don't want to take too many through because the sphere is the most dominant form and yellow is one of the most dominant colours. And if we add too many, we'll add a lot of competition to the existing placements. Just enough to lead the eye around, but maybe we'll finish off with just a couple that are inverted like the original Corcosmia placements. Just a little subtle touch down the bottom, repeating what's in the top to create a really small area of interest in this area down here. Just using a couple of binds of paper covered wire to hold them in place because they will last very well out of water. So using some of the smaller ones that are a slightly paler colour, so they're not so dominant. Actually, they'll hold in place with one bind. Just making one lower than the other. Tying them up higher so that their stems hang freely and the flower doesn't seem to be choked. Tucking them in. Checking that all the stems are going into water where necessary. And that all the spaces are filled. And there's the last piece for you, the Tatami-a-thon, we could call it. So thank you for joining the live stream today. It's been my pleasure to present for you. As I said earlier, the Boerma Institute have lots of opportunities for you to learn, so I encourage you to have a look at their website or their social media platforms. And hopefully I will be back here one day to share floral design with you, either here or somewhere around the world. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much, Mark. We have one last comment in the chat. Sally Hardy says, fabulous and inspirational designs. Wonderful demonstration with so much information.
Excellent. It's been my pleasure. Thanks.
So we have one small thing for you as a thank you for everything that you did and taught everyone. I think you'll like it. We talked about it earlier.
Oh.
This one for you. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's a surprise in gold. And, well, if only I could read Dutch, but it's white something and it feels like chocolate.
It is.
Yeah,
indeed.
Chocolate. Thank you.
Yes, thank you also so much for
Thanks.
everything. Really appreciate it. So then, thank you everyone also so much for joining in to this live stream. Thank you so much, Mark, again. It was really amazing to see you work. If you like this video and you would like to see more videos like this, please hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to our channel because it would help us out a lot. We have live streams every other week, and we've been talking with Mark about maybe a possible return in the future, so keep an eye on our website, please. And Mark is going to New Zealand in 2 weeks. Is that open for booking?
I'm not sure, but check my social media and website, and if there are links to those events, they'll be there. Otherwise, contact me by direct message or send me an email at mark@markpampling.com, and I will be able to direct you in the right way to find out more information.
Awesome. So thank you very much, everyone, again, and see you in the next video.